Hi, it's Angela Kellett, and welcome to Season 1 of Press the Button. As part of this 10-episode season called Taking Back the Narrative, we are handing the microphone to members of communities affected by nuclear weapons, so they can share their stories and their experiences in the ways they want them to be told. Today's guest is Shampa Biswas. She is professor of politics at Whitman College and a Ploughshares Fund 2022 Equity Rises grantee. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Kalina and Lauren Billett.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Tom, it's great to see you. It has been a while since we've done this.
Lauren, great to see you again. Yes, it's been a productive and welcome break. And now we are excited to be back in the swing of things for this new season. You know, it's kind of like we did 200 episodes of season 0. And today, this is the first episode of season 1, which we are calling Taking Back the Narrative.
Yes, and I am so excited about this season. So each week, we're handing the microphone to members of communities impacted by nuclear weapons so they can share their stories and experiences and how they want to tell them. Some conversations you'll hear this season include how nuclear weapons testing and climate change are impacting the Marshall Islands now.
You'll hear about the toll, whether that be mental, physical, or emotional, that advocates for the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act have to deal with.
How Marshallese who relocated to the U.S. in states like Arkansas advocated for better access to healthcare and education, and the effectiveness of the Compact of Free Association.
And we're excited to share this season with our listeners and to hear from an incredible lineup of guests.
Yes, we are. So, Tom, I know that you've missed this. What do you have for us this week on the nuclear front?
I really have missed the nuclear news, so it's great to be back. So, nuclear news. The Russian Defense Ministry said Friday that pilots in Belarus now have been trained to use nuclear weapons as part of Russia's plan to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus later this year. You know, this is clearly an attempt by President Putin to rattle the nuclear saber yet again as he tries to get the West to back off in Ukraine. But it is also shining a spotlight on NATO, which hosts U.S. nuclear weapons in a similar way. As our listeners know, about 100 U.S. nuclear warheads are believed to be stored across 5 NATO nations: Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. And of course, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been signed by Washington and Moscow, prohibits them from transferring nuclear weapons to non-nuclear states. The way NATO gets around this is to say, well, first, this has been grandfathered, right? This was an arrangement that existed before the Non-Proliferation Treaty, so it's been grandfathered in. They also say that the weapons are in the U.S. possession and are not technically transferred. And then they say that such transfer would only happen in wartime, at which point the treaty would not apply. So, you know, many experts see this as a breach of the spirit of the treaty, if not the letter. So NATO has been saying that the Belarus situation is nothing like the NATO case, but that position may get harder to defend over time. The Japanese government is arranging a meeting between the group of 7 leaders and atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima in May when Japan hosts the G7. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is seeking to highlight nuclear weapons at this event. Arrangements are being made for the leaders to meet with the atomic bomb survivors during a visit to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial on May 19th. This would be the first joint visit to the museum dedicated to conveying the horrors of the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima in 1945 by leaders of the G7, which include, of course, nuclear powers Britain, France, and the United States.
And lastly, the United States, Japan, and South Korea conducted missile defense exercises on Monday to improve their response to North Korean threats, as Pyongyang accused Washington of ramping up, quote, nuclear blackmail. During talks in Washington on Friday, the 3 nations agreed to hold regular missile defense and anti-submarine exercises. And in recent weeks, North Korea has increased its military activities, including the testing of a new solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missile. The South Korean and Japanese governments also resumed, quote, 2+2 talks on Monday in Seoul after a 5-year freeze.
And for the first interview of this new season, I sit down with Shampa Biswas. She's a professor at Whitman College and a 2022 Ploughshares Fund Equity Rises grantee. She explains how intersectional thinking in nuclear policy changes the nature of the conversation, why current thinking surrounding the concept of security can be dangerous, and the ways in which the nuclear field can engage with young people. I learned a lot from this interview, particularly about intersectionality, so please tune in.
That sounds like a fantastic interview, Tom. I can't wait to hear it. And so for our listeners, if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show.
Today, in the first episode of Season 1 of Press the Button, I am joined by Shampa Biswas. She is a professor of politics at Whitman College and a Ploughshares Fund 2022 Equity Rises grantee. She recently published an op-ed in the Seattle Times called "The Lesson of This Moment: Abolish Nuclear Weapons." For this 10-episode season called Taking Back the Narrative, we are handing the microphone to communities that have been affected by nuclear weapons so they can share their stories and their experiences in the ways they want to tell them. These conversations will explore how nuclear weapons and climate change have displaced Marshallese people, the human cost of advocating for radiation victims, and how nuclear weapons have affected the Hanford Downwinders and the Navajo Nation. We will explore issues like climate change, economic security, racial injustice, and how they are related to nuclear policy. So, let's get started. Shampa, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So, intersectionality. It's a really big word. We hear about it a lot, but maybe not everyone knows exactly what it means. So, tell us, what does it mean to you, and in what ways does nuclear policy intersect with colonialism, racism, feminism, environmentalism, and so many other issues?
Sure. So I would say intersectionality is a long word, not necessarily a big word. A big word makes it sound kind of intimidating. I might even say that it's a simple but profound word, or it's a simple word that does a lot of complex work. So the concept of intersectionality itself originally comes from the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who I believe was writing in the late 1980s. At a very basic level, what the concept tells us, explains, describes is how systems or structures of inequality, and I want to sort of make sure that we emphasize we're talking about structures and not just identity, how systems or structures of inequality intersect or work with each other to shape the lived experiences of different groups. So I'll say a little bit about Kimberly Crenshaw's work. Crenshaw was working in the field of legal studies. And the point that she made early on was groups or sort of categories that have the legal status of being protected classes, like race, gender, ethnicity, religion, that are protected from discrimination by being a member of one of these particular groups. Those categories don't work separately in the ways that discrimination is experienced by people on the ground. So the experiences of discrimination often are based on the ways that these categories intersect, collide, combine with each other. So Crenshaw's work in particular was pointing out the discrimination faced by Black women that is shaped both by their being members of the category of race, of being Black people, but also as women, right? And how that sort of combined to shape their experiences. So I wanted to talk about the specificity of Crenshaw's work because I think sometimes the work of Black women scholars in particular and the specificities of their projects are sort of either don't get due attention or misappropriated in all kinds of ways. So, but in itself, intersectionality illuminates the complexity of how different forms of inequalities work together. So I'll use an example. Let's say a Black man and an Asian woman in contemporary America may both experience racism, but the quality, texture of that experience is going to be very different, not just because of the very different histories and trajectories of anti-Blackness and anti-Asian bigotry, but also because they occupy different categories of gender. So we can add another layer of inequality to this. Say we have a wealthy Asian woman and a poor Black man, right? So it is possible that wealth may give you access to certain resources that mitigate some of the effects of racism, say by giving you access to housing. But it may also be the case that wealth may make you the subject of racial envy, right? From other groups, from majority groups, but maybe also from other minority groups. And the reason I say this is because I think intersectionality is sometimes caricatured as a form of oppression Olympics, where all the different kinds of oppressions sort of add up, accumulate to create a hierarchy of oppressions, where somebody ends up at the top and somebody ends up at the bottom. And that's not how the concept works at all. It really sort of opens us up to thinking about the ways that different structures of inequality work in complex ways to shape different experiences. Sometimes they contradict each other, sometimes they combine, sometimes they accumulate, sometimes they modify the experience of discrimination through one category. I'm going to use a brief example from the nuclear field. So we know that a lot of nuclear weapons testing happened on formerly or currently colonized or indigenous lands. And we know that imperial power or racialized assumptions about disposability, about whose lands and bodies are disposable, played some part in the selection of these test sites, right? For instance, the Marshall Islands for the US or French-occupied Polynesia for the French. So we could say that all inhabitants displaced or exposed to dangerous levels of radioactivity from these tests are victims of racism. But we also know that displacement has different gendered effects, right? So it increases the burdens on women in displaced communities in very particular ways. They take on a lot of different kinds of work in displaced communities. We also know that ionizing radiation affects women's reproductive health, and women often don't speak up about their health concerns, about their bodily concerns, especially bodily concerns related to intimate parts of their lives, and that is the work of patriarchy. So intersectionality means that, in the nuclear field, means that we're attentive to how these different forms of inequality work together to produce different kinds of experiences of both racism and gender. And we can add other axes of inequalities to these as well.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, because that's very helpful to me. And in fact, it differs from the way I had been thinking about it, or the way I'd seen others talking about it, which is the intersection of different issues in, say, the progressive space, nuclear, climate change, racial injustice. You're talking about it much more of different communities that are suffering oppression and how those things are linked. Am I getting that right?
That's right. I mean, that's where the concept of intersectionality itself comes from, thinking about systems of inequality. But we can complicate that and think about the ways that different issues intersect as well.
Fascinating. Okay. So now let's bring this into focus around, say, nuclear policy. How, in your view, is it important to understand intersectionality in terms of nuclear policy? Why do we want to do that? Will it help us change the way we view nuclear policy? And if so, how and why?
Okay. So in the way that you were thinking about intersectionality, I mean, that's one way we should think about nuclear policy, that nuclear weapons issues intersect with climate change issues, intersect with racism, intersect with gender defects, right? So absolutely, that's one way in which nuclear policy should be informed by the ways that different issues cut across each other. Does intersectionality make its way into nuclear policy thinking? I don't know. I think it depends on what policy we are talking about, who is that policy being made for and by whom. I think if you're thinking about nuclear policy at the very top echelons of governments in nuclear weapon states, echelons where people are thinking about strategic doctrine, which weapon systems to acquire or modernize, whether to adopt a no first use policy or not. In those spheres, I don't see much intersectionality at play. I don't see it making its way in there, both in terms of who's at the table, which I think is still not a very diverse table, and what kinds of issues, questions, concerns rise to the top of the agenda. So I think, based on what I've already said, it will be no surprise to you, intersectional analyses from the margins push towards nuclear disarmament, push towards nuclear abolition, I don't see much space in nuclear policy making for nuclear disarmament as a serious issue yet.
So on a day-to-day basis, if intersectionality thinking were to be playing a larger role in nuclear policy, how would it change nuclear policy, right? And you just talked about nuclear abolition. Are there things, and obviously that's a huge change, and maybe not one we're going to get right away, but how would you say if there were a new thinking towards intersectionality, how would that change the way nuclear policy is implemented or thought of in the US context or internationally?
Yeah, so I think it would make people think about nuclear weapons differently. So I think currently we think about nuclear weapons, not we, or most policymakers think about nuclear weapons as weapons of deterrence, right? That do the work of keeping us secure in some fashion, right? Intersectional thinking about nuclear weapons sort of really opens up nuclear weapons to thinking about them through its entire production chain, the entire nuclear fuel cycle, right from uranium mining onto milling and processing and ending with, of course, waste disposal. And once you start doing that and you start listening to communities who live in and around those sites and have for decades, right, been drawing attention to the harmful effects of nuclear production, I think it makes us think differently about what these weapons are doing for us, right? So I think sort of expanding the voices at the table, bringing in the perspectives of those who've been thinking about nuclear weapons as not just weapons that make us safe because we have them, but also having consequences beyond that. I think it changes the nature of the conversation and what we think about what work these weapons are doing, how many of them we need to be secure.
And you started getting on to my next question, which is how do you change that thinking? And you just started it, I think, by saying you have to change who's at the table, but say more about that if you could.
So I'll say, I'll go to my own experiences. I'm an educator. My primary audience is young people. And that's who I want to change, with the hope that they are the ones who get to the table eventually. My work starts with education. And I'll say a little bit about my experience with young people. I know it's somewhat limited. I teach at a liberal arts institution, which lends itself to, I think, intersectional thinking, to thinking across boundaries. And I could go on about the value of a liberal arts education. But mostly those are the kids I'm talking to. I have 2 sons in college, so I'm talking to them as well. And my sense is that young people are much better able than people from our generation to think across lines of difference. I think they're able to do that with much more ability, much more ease. For us, I think intersectionality is either a theoretical concept that we use to understand how the world works, how discrimination is experienced differently, or it's a political weapon that's wielded by the political right to go after critical race theory, for instance, right? I think for many young people, maybe not all, but for many young people, intersectionality is not just the texture of their lives, but their understanding of how the world works. My students get how power and privilege work across different categories. I see young people embracing much more gender fluidity. They're much more racially aware. They're more suspicious of capitalist quick fixes to climate change, how these issues connect. They're much more open. My feeling is that those of us in the nuclear studies field, in the nuclear field, really need to respond to that opening. I think young people are open, but we need to give them the tools to work with that opening. Right. So there was a time when the anti-nuclear movement was really active in the US. That's no longer the case, has not been the case since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Right. So young people are much more, I think, much more in tune with climate change activism, with anti-racism, but they're not really thinking about nuclear weapons quite as much. And they don't see the connections between them quite as much. And those connections have always been there. Like the leaders of the Black Panther Party, had a position on the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Martin Luther King Jr. had a position on nuclear disarmament. So did the third world leaders of the 1955 Bandung Conference, right? So people were making the connection between anti-racism, colonialism, and nuclear disarmament early on. But I feel that our students are not doing that. They don't know about that history. And it's our job to bring that to them, to activate them more as anti-nuclear thinkers, workers. I'll say a little bit about one of my current projects that you alluded to at the start. It's a project on which I'm collaborating with a bunch of colleagues, and Ploughshares is helping fund that. And that project is really to transform nuclear studies. And to transform nuclear studies by putting race, colonialism, gender, disability, ecological thinking, intersectionally right at the center of that study. So not tacked on, not just added on to a syllabus in which students first learn to think through the box of nuclear strategic thinking, think and understand the logic of nuclear deterrence, hear all the arguments about tactical versus strategic weapons and why it may make sense to invest in tactical weapons. And then you get to the critiques, but sort of integrate that thinking, intersectional thinking, right from the very start and into the very fabric of the syllabus. So our project is to create a new curriculum, to create new teaching materials, new pedagogic techniques, and distribute them widely. Hopefully other educators will take them up. So my sense is young people are open. We need to find ways to engage them. They are going to be the policymakers of the future. That's how policy changes.
Well, that makes perfect sense to me. I have 3 kids. I completely agree. The younger generation is way more open to new ideas and new ways of thinking.
They're just more creative, interesting thinkers than I think we are. We're much more stuck in our silos.
They're open to new ideas, right? And they accept those new ideas like sponges, right? They don't resist them like people of our generation who fight tooth and nail against anything new. So completely agree on that concept of young people being open to these ideas. And really interested in what you said about look, the way we should teach about nuclear policy is not start with your ancestors' deterrence theory, right? And go through how we talked about these things 50 years ago, but embed them in the issues the young people care about today, whatever that be. Racial fairness, climate change. That makes sense to me. Have you seen it? And presumably you put it in practice in your classroom every day. Tell us your experience with it. Does it work? Do you find that when you explain or present nuclear policies in this broader context, that young people that you work with go there and that it brings them into it better than a more traditional approach would?
Yes, I think it grabs their imagination and their current engagements in a way that teaching a more conventional syllabus on nuclear weapons simply does not. I mean, deterrence is really quite literally very far away from the lives of most of they don't think about it actively, right? But they are thinking about racism. They are thinking about climate change. They have to think about climate change. They can't not think about climate change, right? So when I connect nuclear weapons issues with those issues, I think it sort of takes, in a way, it makes it more engaging. It makes sense to them. It helps them see how different forms of different social movements connect with each other. They're not separate issues. It also helps them see that to be a nuclear weapons policymaker or to be somebody who can have an authoritative voice on nuclear weapons issues, you don't just need to be a technocrat. I think a lot of my students are sort of intimidated by the thought of entering the field of nuclear studies because it requires a very particular kind of knowledge, a very particular kind of expertise. And I think just talking about nuclear weapons more broadly and connected with other issues and making it more engaging for their own experiences makes them more likely to enter that field.
Well, that's great. And I can't wait for your students to get into Congress, because all I can say is members of Congress that we have today, most of them, not all of them, but most of them tend to think about these issues in the old way. And that's part of the problem, is that groups in Washington tend to talk about them in the old way because that's the way Congress wants to hear about them. But we need to change that. And so I'm very encouraged and excited to hear about what you're saying and how to educate young people who, as you say correctly, are the future and hopefully will be in Congress someday. But let's get to this issue of hope, right? And I assume that the way you're talking about nuclear issues and relating it to all these other issues also gives you a way to talk about nuclear policy and change in a more hopeful way, where if you talk about it in the old way, it's hard to get a sense that we're making much progress right now. But give us your sense of how talking about nuclear policy in a broader context helps motivate people to get involved.
So I'll say something about hope. So I don't create hope. I'm a teacher and a mother. Hope is what gets me out of bed. I don't see that I have a different option, right? It's a necessity. So the adage that I think I lean on, and it's an adage that's attributed to Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, although the exact genealogy of where it came from is more complicated. But nevertheless, the adage is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? So if I was to look at the future, if I was to do a sober analysis of the future, especially from the perspective of young people, it doesn't generate much hope, right? The future seems bleak. If you look at the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what it's telling us about the turning point, unless we do something now, it makes the future seem bleak. The activation of nuclear threats recently in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine doesn't make me think that we are getting closer to nuclear disarmament. The rise of racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism in the US, the rise of sort of right-wing nationalist, hate-fueling governments around the world, all of that, I mean, if you look at all of that together, it feels a little bit hopeless at times, I would say, looking at it from the perspective of young people, right? And I don't want to deny the toll that thinking about that kind of future takes on young people who are coming out of a pandemic that hit them during their formative years. Young people are struggling in all sorts of ways. But having said that, my students still show up in my class with real curiosity. They ask the big questions. They are passionate. They also understand that knowledge can wear you down, but knowledge also entails an obligation, or at least I remind them that it does. I think it's still 10% of the world that has a college degree, something like that. So having knowledge can make you feel bleak about the future, but it also demands from you action. It obligates you to work towards crafting better futures. So I'm going to say it's a bleak world, any way you look at it, but hope gets you out of the bed, I'm sure, to do this podcast. You're also educating people and raising awareness. It gets me out of the bed to teach my students. It gets my students out of the bed to get to my classes and really care. And there are so many members of marginal frontline communities who are showing up every day in really bleak circumstances, sometimes against great odds, to fight against the siting of nuclear reactors, the storing of nuclear waste in their communities, to fight against racism, sexual harassment. I mean, hope is what propels people to that, but it's also what keeps people alive and joyous. Like the work itself makes you hopeful. Itself gives you the conditions that helps you move on. For many people, I think it's sustenance, right? Doing that work itself. So I don't think much about hope. I just take it for granted, to be honest.
I completely agree. If you don't have hope, we can't keep going. So it's right. What propels us forward to put one foot in front of the other. So no, I really appreciate your thoughts on that. Let's talk for a minute about how different people view security, right? And the concept of security, and how one's concept of security can really depend on your lived experience. How you see something depends on where you sit or where you stand. What are your views on that as you work with different communities in this intersectional space on the concept of security?
So I think we can think about security in at least two different ways, one of which you just alluded to. And I'm a little ambivalent about the concept of security. I'll get to that. Maybe I'm going to sound a little bit academic there. There's the everyday commonsensical of understanding of security, the everyday lived experience of security that you already alluded to. There's a minimalist version of it, which is to live in a condition free of threats and violence and dangers. And there's a more expansive version of that, is to have conditions of life that help you flourish, that help you thrive, right? I think if you think about security in that form, for many people in the world, for racial minorities, for sexual minorities, for poor people, they would say they live very insecure lives, right? The life is very insecure on an everyday basis. I think that's also true, as I've already mentioned, for many people who live in and around reactor sites, uranium mines, nuclear waste storage sites. They experience insecurity. That's sort of the everyday commonsensical understanding of security. But then we have a more formal definition of security, which is the statist version of security, which is what we call national security. And that is being secure from or being protected from the enemies of the state, whether those are other state actors, non-state actors like terrorist groups. And security in that formulation collapses into military security. It means having a strong military, having nuclear weapons to keep us secure. So in the field of critical security studies, there has been a lot of thinking about the ways that military nuclear security compromises everyday security, right? It takes attention away from the other lived form of insecurities that I already talked about, or it directly makes people, military security can directly make people insecure. And one response to that in critical security studies has been to expand the concept of security. So we now talk about economic security, environmental security, human security, right? So I think at a certain level, we can think of that as a useful move because it really gets us to thinking about how security is experienced by everyday people rather than how the state thinks about security. But, I also have some sort of reservations about the expansion of that category of security because security has become, in part because the state has so much hold over that concept of security, our understanding of it is very militarized, right? So I worry when we expand that category of security, attach it to other issues, it locks us into certain ways of thinking and certain responses to that issue that comes from that kind of thinking. So economic security leads to perhaps the war on poverty. We remember this. There was a war on poverty, which becomes a war on the poor, right? Environmental security, is nature the enemy? Who's the enemy here? So I worry about the expansion of the category of security. I understand that one way of demilitarizing it is by expanding it to other places. But I also wonder if it ends up militarizing other issues. And we need sort of better framings of those issues rather than think of them through sort of that framing of war and enemies and the military.
That's interesting. Clearly, we need to think about security more broadly than national security, as you're saying. But we don't want to militarize and weaponize all the other types of security. So what do you think? What might be an approach to bring these issues together and sort of humanize national security, if you will?
Yeah, so I don't know that I have the answer to it. It's honestly a question I struggle with. And when I teach security, I put it on the table for my students to think through as an unresolved question. That's how I teach anyways. I don't usually tell them what I think. And I ask them not to try to guess what I think because my head is way too complicated and messy and I don't want them to get in there. I put out the paradoxes, the dilemmas, the questions for them, and I want them to think through it. I don't know that I have figured this out. I do think that we need to take away the definition of security from the statist definitions, the militaristic definitions. But I think we also need to be mindful of what it is when we are talking about when we talk about other kinds of security, or sort of mindful of falling into that trap of thinking through militarized lens. I think that's the best we can do, is sort of both complicate the concept, but also sort of keep in mind that the way we use the concept opens us up to certain ways of thinking and acting that may not be fruitful.
We are coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you one more question, which is, given your experience working with students and your work in all the different ways of thinking about intersectionality, for other people who are trying to do education on nuclear policy and change nuclear policy, what are one or two things you might suggest and how the best way to do that? And then if you could tell our listeners where they could go to learn more about all the great information you've been talking about today.
So I think what we are doing here is useful, Tom. I think talking more conversations between educators in the conventional sense, educators who are in academia, and folks in the media, folks doing nuclear policy work, practitioners, activists, is helpful. Our vocabularies and the language we use are very much shaped by the environments in which we work, right? So there is actually a work of translation in stepping outside of that zone. And I think we all need to do that better. And I will say that teaching undergraduates, I don't teach graduate students. I teach at a small liberal arts college. Teaching undergraduates is very helpful for that. It forces me to not always use jargon that, is easier for me to do because I'm trained to do that. So I think we all need to sort of learn to sort of talk with each other, all those of us who are interested in similar issues, but are located in very different work environments, to talk more with each other and translate our work for others. I think we should also embrace the idea that we are all educators, right? And the mode of that education is different. How we teach is different depending on where we are, but we all have things to learn from each other as educators. Like we have different pedagogic techniques to learn from each other as educators, not just content, but even like the ways we teach. So I would like to expand the category of educator beyond the academy as well.
And how can people learn more about what you're doing?
I just talked about the project, the teaching project that I'm involved in, the Transforming Nuclear Studies project. The materials that we are creating for that will be available at an open access site. It's a group called Highly Enriched, Highly N capital Enriched. It's an online platform which really acts as a hub for educational resources for professors, for practitioners, for activists, for educators of all different kinds. So that's where the materials for that will live. And I'm going to encourage people to go there. They're not going to be up till later in the summer. There are already a lot of education materials available at that site, but our particular project on decolonizing nuclear studies is going to live there. I might send people also to a very recent edition of a special issue of the journal International Affairs. It's a July 2022 issue, and it's a collection of essays that take on the question of intersectionality with respect to nuclear politics. So they're thinking about colonialism, racism, environmentalism, gender, indigeneity, intersectionally, as it applies to the nuclear field. It's a fantastic collection of essays. I think it's a great place to learn more about that work.
Shampa, thank you so much for being here. Great conversation, and I really wish you all the best in all your work.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Alex Hall, Angela Kellett, and Loan Billett, and in San Francisco by Charles Crosby. Audio engineering by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is Black Nymph by Peridot. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.